Hi, today I'm going to show you some basic failures of cheap vacuum cleaners and how to fix them. I'm also going to show you how those machines work, how do they vacuum, and how to fix its common problems. So let me demonstrate how a vacuum cleaner works. The cold air with the dust comes in from here, goes to a pipe from here, and goes to this compartment. Inside this compartment there is a filter that collects most of the dust, and some dust particles can pass through this filter. So there is another filter for the dust particles that escape this one. So the extra dust particles get stuck on those filters, but some very small dust particles still can reach to the motor. Here is the motor. The motor sucks up cold air from this side with some dust in it and exhausts it from this side and this side, right here. The motor also cools itself by the cold air that comes from here. There's also some dust in this cold air, so there were some filters on the exhaust. As you can see, there were some filters on the exhaust, but I removed them. So when it comes to why I removed those filters is the fact that they're not user removable. So there is some dust that comes in here and it gets stuck in those filters, and after 1 or 2 years of use, those filters get completely blocked. When these filters get completely blocked, the motor cannot exhaust. When the motor cannot exhaust, it overheats. And when it overheats, it cannot function properly. So the suction power decreases a lot. This was one of the most common failures of those cheap machines. The motor in these are really common, and they are brushed AC motors. There's brushes in them, and they run out of brushes when it gets older and older. They usually run out of brushes after 7 years or so. I had to replace the brushes on a very old vacuum cleaner because the brushes were completely grinded. So this one still has its brushes intact, but those filters were completely blocked and the motor was overheating inside, and when the motor was overheating, the switch got melted here. There's a switch here that controls the power to the motor, so if you put it on the O side, it doesn't send power to the motor, and if you put it on the on side, it sends power to the motor. So when the motor overheats, this plastic can easily melt because the switch is also very cheap. So I had to replace the switch, I had to remove the dust filters, and I also had to remove the old plug because the old plug was broken and it wasn't sending power to the machine. So the plugs usually break right here, right on the strainer lead, because when you plug the device in to a wall outlet and you pull on it, where you go with the vacuum cleaner and the cable pulls on the plug, so when it pulls on the plug, this copper inside starts to break, and when it starts to break, it becomes worse and worse, and it completely loses connection over time. And sometimes this cable even may short circuit, so if it short circuits, it may trip your breaker or it may make a spark. Inside these machines are a motor and a capacitor that's connected in parallel to the motor. The capacitor is for smoothing the voltage of the motor so the motor doesn't eat up the brushes, because these motors can be very unstable with unstable voltage because they are AC motors. And there's also a thermal fuse in series with these motors. So if the motor overheats, this thermal fuse usually trips, and the tripping point of this thermal fuse in there is usually 120 degrees Celsius. Because these motors are usually rated for 100 degrees Celsius when it's working full power. So when these filters get blocked up, the motor overheats more and more, and the thermal fuse trips in there and it stops working. As you can see on the label, let me show the label to you. Right here. As you can see, it says 890 watts. That's a lot of power for a small machine. So if 800 watts of power isn't being cooled enough, and those filters are completely full of dust, the motor starts to overheat and it starts to break. And the other problems of those machines are the fact that they have cheap build quality, so the plastic on there cracks really fast. Only after three years of use, those plastic parts cracked, and I had to glue them with super glue and some baking soda. If you combine baking soda with super glue, it creates a great bond that fixes these joints. Normally this vacuum cleaner had a removable holder like this, so you were able to remove it from this button. You had to just slide this button to the right and this was popping off. So the problem was there was really small plastics, really thin pieces of plastics that was holding this part, so when those plastics broke off, it just became useless and it just kept falling off. So I had to completely glue it with baking soda and super glue. You can't really do much about the bad plastic build quality because these machines are really cheap, because they're really cheap to manufacture, and the motors in them are pretty effective when you maintain them properly. Like if you replace the brushes every 7 years or so, and if you remove those filters, because those filters are nothing else than blocking airflow, and those filters don't really block dust that's going out. When those filters fill up with dust, it actually throws some dust outside when you first start up the motor, because there is a big air force that's coming out of the filters and the vents when you first power up the motor. So the filters just make the situation worse, and you just have to get rid of them. And when these plastic parts crack, you can't really do much about them other than gluing them with super glue and some baking soda, because if you try to fix those small plastic parts, they're gonna break again and they're not gonna create a good mold with them. So it's just gonna break again and again and again and again. So also this part here, let me just remove it. So there's the dust compartment, as you can see right here. There's the dust compartment and there's a valve on it, so when the dust goes in here, it opens this flap, and when the machine is powered off, so there's no dust coming in, this flap goes like this, so there's no dust escaping from this side. The problem with this part was the fact that this was movable to right and left 360 degrees, but it broke off really easily, and it was just held by a tiny piece of plastic that only broke in like 6 months of use, so I had to glue this with super glue again. So these machines have really cheap build quality, but their motors are pretty decent. These motors in those machines rarely fail, and when it comes to suction power of those machines, it's good for general use. It's nothing too impressive, but it's it gets the job done. This was Arduino Atelier, and I showed you how to fix the common problems of those vacuum cleaners and show them how they work. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please like and consider subscribing to my channel.